Thank you all for joining today's information session on the decision-making process for care coordination organization enrollment. My name is Ariel Chatzoff from the Talent Development and Training at OPWDD. And just as a reminder, the previous information sessions are all available on our website as well as the PowerPoints associated with those. Today's information session will be available within the next couple days, as well as the PowerPoint for you to be able to print. We will have additional sessions added to the website soon, so please check back. We usually also announce those via advisory. And with that, we'll get started for today. Presenting today's session is Leslie Fold from Person-Centered Support.
Okay. So we're going to go over today a lot of information that was in the May 4th memo that went out to the field called Decision-Making Process for Enrollment and Care Coordination Organizations, and we'll just start from the basics. So for the individuals you serve, there are two choices to be made in the enrollment process into care coordination organizations. The first is a selection of the care coordination organization. The individualized letters that are being provided to individuals should include what care coordination organizations operate in the county of the state that they live in. The second selection that has to be made is for care management service of either health home care management or basic HCBS support. Okay, again from the memo I just spoke of, which by the way was sent to all of our provider agencies, so if you have not seen that yet, you should go up your chain of command and request to be able to see that memorandum that was sent. And in that memo, it outlined that by May 15th, 2018, MSC agencies should determine who have not been enrolled in a CCO yet. As of June 1st, there should be attempts to send to the decision makers outlined in the memo, which we'll talk about in a moment, those people who you need a decision made for. And I just want to be very clear that the last step to enrollment into CCOs is to record a person's choice in the choices application on the CCO selection form. Please be sure that is done by June 30th. The new service goes into effect on July 1st, so you must record every individual selection in choices no later than June 30th. Okay, so for importance of enrollment, this is also outlined in the memorandum that I referred to from May 4th, and we just wanted to be sure that people were clear that it is really important that you make sure that an individual or their decision maker understands that enrollment in a CCO and one of the services the CCOs will be offering is necessary in order to maintain eligibility for OPWDD HCBS services. I just want to be clear, I'm sure everyone knows by now, but Medicaid Service Coordination and PCSS do not exist after June 30th, so there is no option to remain in those services. A person must enroll in a CCO and make a choice of service. Okay, so this refers to, on May 4th, we sent an email to all of the agencies that outlined the steps in the decision-making process for this enrollment. And that email had the decision-making memo. Again, the actual title of the memo was Decision-Making Process for Enrollment in CCOs. There was an MSC tracker for enrollment activities. There was a list of contact information for the DDROs and the DDSOOs, and also CCO contact information. Okay, so there are three possibilities for decision making. Obviously, if an individual can make their own decision, then they should be doing so for themselves. If an individual is not able to make their own decision, but has a decision maker available, which will run through the outline of those decision makers, or an individual is not able to make their own decision and they do not have someone in their life who can make a decision for them, or that person is unavailable or not responsive. Okay, I think I already said this. If the individual has the ability to choose a CCO and a care management service, or if they can do so with your assistance by explaining the process so they understand, then that person should make their own enrollment decisions. And I just want to be clear, too, that please do not confuse this with the level of informed consent for things such as medical procedures. This is not an informed consent situation. So if a person can generally make their own decisions, they should be able to make this decision either on their own or with your assistance in understanding what they need to decide. So if a person cannot make a decision for themselves and they do not have, for example, a guardian, then this is from the emergency regulation that tells you the people who may make a decision, and it is in this order listed. So an actively involved spouse, an actively involved parent, an actively involved adult child, an actively involved adult sibling, or any other actively involved adult family member. For Willowbrook class individuals, the Consumer Advisory Board may make a decision, but obviously only for Willowbrook class individuals. If an individual's advocate is not one of the parties listed, then they cannot be a decision maker. So we've gotten a lot of questions on this. So if someone has, for example, a correspondent or advocate who maybe is a staff member who used to work for their agency and then left, but they wanted to remain involved to assist the individual, that advocate cannot make this decision for people. Okay, so when there is not one of those individuals available to make a decision, right, we're always going to go to that first in that order, and I just want to be clear that the term actively involved is really somewhat determined by the agency. If a person has a brother who you would typically go to, they come to reviews, your agency perceives them as someone who can make a decision or assist the individual, then that is adequate for this purpose. So if an individual lacks the ability to make a choice, they do not have a guardian, and there are no one in the list that we just went over, which again is from the emergency regulation and is also found in that May 4th memorandum, then the CEO of the agency that operates the individual's residential facility or sponsoring the family care home, or a designee of that CEO, can make the enrollment decision for the individual. If the individual's residential facility is operated by OPWDD, then the DDSO director would be the equivalent of the CEO of the agency, and they can make that decision. If the person does not reside in any certified residential setting at all, and again does not have a decision maker, then the director of the DDRO for the region in which the person lives can make an enrollment decision for the individual. So So before you go to a CEO of the residential agency or the director of the DDSO, or again, if the person does not live in a certified residential setting or family care home, then we go to the DDRO director. You cannot request that they make a decision until you have made at least 3 attempts to contact any of those decision makers we talked about before. So if the person has an actively involved brother, you cannot go to the director or CEO of the residential agency until you have attempted and documented to reach that person for this enrollment at least 3 times. So the documentation will need to go to whatever decision maker. Let's just say, for the sake of argument here, the person lives in a voluntary residential intermediate care facility. They live in an ICF. So before you go to that agency's CEO to make the decision, you're going to have to document those attempts you made to contact the brother, so that the CEO of that agency knows you've made the appropriate attempts to contact someone. Now, we have not prescribed a specific manner in which you document these. Most commonly, I think we might see them in the notes of the MSC, but if your agency determines they want to use another format, that's also acceptable, but it must be both sent to the decision maker, and you need to keep a copy of that documentation for the person's own record as well. Okay, so in the case of an individual or a legally appointed guardian, or in the case that that individual or the legally appointed guardian is saying, I am not making a decision, they're refusing to make an enrollment decision, you know, please be clear so that people understand that, you know, this is a problem, because you know, an enrollment decision needs to be made in order to keep OPWDD services, as we talked about earlier. And the MSC must notify the appropriate DDRO contact of this situation in writing. That's something else that also needs to be in the individual's clinical record, but this is a little bit different, because in the case that an individual or the legally appointed guardian are refusing to make a decision, you need to notify the DDRO in writing. I just want to be clear about that, because it's kind of an additional thing that you must do if the individual or the guardian are saying, I will not make a decision. So for submissions to a decision maker, you need to include, and I just want to be clear that this is right now one of the most common issues that we're hearing from the field, is that when a decision is requested from one of the decision makers we spoke of, it is not including the necessary information. So again, this is for a CEO of a voluntary provider, the DDSO director, the DDRO director. You must include the person's current IFP, the individualized information letter for that particular individual, consent forms for both health home and basic HCBS plan support, because we don't know which selection the decision maker will make, and again, the documentation of your efforts of contacting the appropriate decision maker at least 3 times if there is a decision maker. If a person does not have any decision maker, then you should also include that information so that the CEO, DDSO director, or DDRO director know that this person does not have anyone. Okay, so just to go over the consent forms, which I know have been done in a number of our recent webinars, so I'm sure they are included in the information that is posted to the website. We have, this is the health home patient information sharing consent. So this is to select the health home service for an adult, and this just has little notations of what an MSC will include and what pieces of the form need to be filled out, and it will not, for example, the name of the health home will not be filled out by the MSC agency. It will be filled out by the person who is looking at the information and saying, this is the CCO we are selecting in the health home. Go ahead. Okay, this is another piece of that same form, just showing what must be completed. And the same thing. This is a consent form for health home for children. So both this and the previous consent form, I just want to be clear, if a person is selecting the basic HCBS plan support option, these would not need to be filled out. Okay, so this is the consent form for the basic HCBS plan support. Again, if a person opts for this plan, this would be the only form there is to be completed. Okay, so the tracking form, again, on May 4th, the email that went out with the memo had an MSC tracker for enrollment decisions. That template was attached to the email that was sent out. The MSC the agency has to complete one template for the individuals that they are requesting a CEO or DDSO director or DDRO director are making a decision for. This should be submitted by an MSC agency, but please be clear, not by each MSC. So if an MSC agency, let's say, has a total of 10 people who live in state operations in one part of the state, your agency will only be submitting one completed tracker, not one for each of the potentially 10 MSCs. It needs to be one complete tracker for everyone you need an enrollment decision from your agency for. Okay, so you send the packet to the agency for decision dependent upon where the person lives. If they live in a certified residential setting that is operated by a voluntary provider agency, then you will send the packets and the tracker to the CEO of that agency who is operating the individual's residential facility. If the person lives in a state-operated residential facility, so something operated by the DDSO, then the packets and the tracker would be sent to the DDSO director in that part of the state. If the individual does not live in any certified residential program, in that instance, the tracker and the packets for each individual would be sent to the DDRO director. Okay, so we just wanted to go over, I mentioned earlier that we have been hearing that sometimes packets are not completed, and that's one of the main problems. So this is kind of what we are collecting and hearing from the field as being the main reasons that there's a problem with these packets that are submitted for decision. One is a missing ISP for the person, or the individualized information letter, which is important because it outlines the CCOs that operate in the county where the person lives, as well as the CCO that the MSC agency has affiliated with. So you want that information to go to the person you're asking to make the decision. Missing documentation of at least 3 attempts to contact the decision maker. Submission by individual Medicaid service coordinators instead of the agency's CEOs. So again, your agency should not be sending trackers from individual MSCs, but one submission for your agency. Packets being submitted to the incorrect decision maker. So again, you know, that's outlined earlier in this presentation, but just to say it one more time, if the person lives in a certified residential facility, then it will go to that agency's CEO. If the person lives in a certified residential setting that is operated by OPWDD, which means the DDSO, then that is the correct decision maker. If the person does not live in any certified residential setting, then the decision would be requested from the DDRO director. And the other most common thing we see is that there is not a tracker submitted. Okay, so we'll talk about transition to state-paid care management, because this has been a little confusing, and understandably so. But a person who is currently receiving state-paid service coordination will be enrolled in a care management agency based on the affiliation of their MSC agency. And this includes individuals such as Willowbrook class members who reside in ICF and nursing homes. So you do not need to do enrollment for those people, because there is a process that they will be enrolled. So if you serve someone who lives in an ICF, you do not need to do this process for that person. Or if you provide services to someone who lives in a nursing home, for example, who is a Willowbrook class member, you do not need to do this. Also, if you make a mistake and you forget that a person, you know, is a Willowbrook individual who lives in an ICF, and you do a form for them, when you go into choices to register that enrollment, it's not going to allow you to do so. Okay, so we also wanted to go over separately, right? So we've talked about decision makers, but we wanted to talk specifically about enrollment for Willowbrook class members, because there's also been some confusion about that. So for class members who are fully represented by the CAB, and any other Willowbrook class members who would need CAB to make their decision for them, the CEO of the MSC agency or their designee completes a spreadsheet with identifying information for all Willowbrook class members on their caseload. So just to be clear, you're going to list every Willowbrook class member, not just those that you are requesting a decision for. The CEO of the MSC agency or their designee will send that completed spreadsheet along with a packet of information, but only for those individuals who you need the CAB to make a decision for, to their executive director, Antonia Ferguson, and we'll give you the address later in the presentation. And then the CAB will centrally distribute that information to the appropriate local representatives. So here is the mailing address that you need to send those packets to. And again, let's just be clear that this package should include the ISP, the individualized information letter, and the consent form. And in addition to the packet, remember, for every place you are sending packets to, you've got to have the appropriate tracker accompanying it. Okay, so after the MSC scheduled the meeting with the CAB representative, they and the class member will discuss the information and the relevant materials with the MSC to determine the enrollment and selection of an appropriate CCO for the class member. So this is the process that CAB is doing for every Willowbrook class member who needs to have enrollment decisions made by them. Okay, the MSC documents the decision for the CCO and the level of service as they do for every other person in the choices system in the CCO selection form. The Medicaid Service Coordinator will then provide signed consent forms and other required documents to the CCO that the person has selected. And the addresses for the CCOs, again, was attached to that same May 4th email that memo and the tracker came out in. So that's where you can obtain that as well. Okay, so for Willowbrook class members who may have a decision maker, let's just stick with, someone who has an actively involved brother and he is unavailable or unresponsive for some reason, then the MSC, again, as in the previous process, always needs to make efforts to obtain a decision from that person. And the efforts to do so have to be documented. We've had questions about what is an appropriate type of contact. It can be phone calls, it can be emails, it can be a mailed letter, it could be an in-person meeting that you document, but probably if they're unavailable, you're not having an in-person meeting with them. So again, if you question if the type of contact you're talking about qualifies, I'm hard-pressed to think of one that does not. So, again, just all of your attempts at contact, document them, please. After at least 3 unsuccessful attempts to obtain a decision from that decision maker, the MSC will notify the CEO of the MSC agency that the CAB needs to make a decision for this Willowbrook class member as well because their decision maker is unresponsive or unavailable. Okay, so the CEO of the MSC agency or their designee will send a new spreadsheet with the identifying information for people who now they have determined need a CAB decision maker, along with the same packet of information to the address for Ms. Ferguson that we identified previously. We're going to make sure we put in the informational letter, the ISP, the consent forms, and your documentation that you did attempt to obtain a decision from, in this instance, the person's brother. So the executive director of the CAB or their designee will discuss this information with the MSC and review relevant materials and complete the consent forms. The MSC will document the decision for the CCO and the level of service in the choices system as must always be done to make the final enrollment. The MSC provides the consent form to the CCO of the individual's choice, and again, the addresses for the CCOs are one of the attachments to that May 4th email that went from OPWDD to all of our provider agencies. Okay, so we just wanted a reminder, I said this a few slides ago, but that all Willowbrook class members should be entered on the spreadsheet that is the Willowbrook Tracker and sent to this address. Okay, so I'm just going to mute for a minute and look at what questions we have coming in here, and we'll be right back. Okay, so we have 3 questions that we're going to go over. Ready?
Alrighty. When an individual requires a decision to be made by the DDRO, who does the MSC submit the additional information to at the DDRO?
So I believe, and I'm looking at people here to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was one of the attachments to the May 4th memo that went out. Just let us quickly check here what the attachments were. Okay, so that memo had a number of attachments, and it had the regional office and the state operations contacts for CCO decision making. So that is there. If for some reason you have really tried to find that and you can't, I would say send it to the DDRO director, and within the DDRO they will direct it to the correct representative, their designee.
Could you please clarify which director does what between the DDRO versus the DDSO?
Yes, I can do, and it's a really good question because I think that for people who work for OPW, we forget that that can be very confusing. So you would contact a DDSO director only in the case that the individual you're seeking a decision for lives in some kind of state-operated facility. That's the only time in this process that you're going to be looking for the DDSO director. The DDRO directors, they don't deal with anyone who lives in a certified program in state operations. So, you know, in an ISP, if the person you're dealing with, if it says that they live in a DDSO residence, then you're going to send it to the DDSO director. The DDROs don't deal with state-operated programs. So in that instance, in their ISP, if it says they live in an IRA operated by a voluntary provider, remember in that instance you're going to go to that voluntary operated CEO. But if you look at it, they need a decision and they don't live in any certified residential setting, that's when you're going to send it to the DDRO director. So I hope that's helpful. Okay.
If a person is able to make a decision but has a legal guardian who cannot be reached, does an MSC still follow the proxy decision-making process, or can that person make their own decision?
Okay. So at any point that a person is capable of making their own decision, they should make their own decision.
Yep, we've gotten a few more questions that we're going to review, so I'm just going to mute the line for a moment.
Okay, we're going to go through the next few questions we've gotten.
When requesting a decision for the consent for an individual in a state-operated IRA, do I need to send a tracker to the director if they do not have any family members?
So in all circumstances that you are sending a packet to any decision maker that we've talked about today, the DDSO director, the regional office director, the CEO of a voluntary provider, it will always include a tracker. But again, I just want to be clear, if you are, let's say you work at an agency and you are one of 6 MSCs, you should not be submitting packets independently to these decision makers. Your agency needs to coordinate the people who you need decisions for and submit them as one.
Okay, great. Now we're going to go into some questions regarding the consent forms. Do the consents that are provided to the CCOs need to include the original signatures?
Right, so good question, yes. The original wet signatures, that's what they call them, I just learned that phrase, have to go to the CCOs. So again, that May 4th email and memorandum that I keep mentioning to you, that had the address for each CCO and the person there designated to receive those. So that's who you should send them to.
Could you please go over what documents are needed to upload to choices regarding the consent?
Okay, so here's the issue. The issue is that it depends upon what care coordination organization your agency has affiliated with. There are 7 care coordination organizations, and I believe they are each setting their own policy on other documents. So you would need to go up your chain of command so that you can find out what the CCO your agency is affiliating with requires for that particular issue.
Can you please explain how to complete the basic HCBS plan support consent form?
So we did show that earlier, but I think what I'm going to defer to is that OPWDD has created a resource guide for Medicaid service coordinators, and it's basically a step-by-step document that an MSC could put in a folder and take with them out to the field and walk through the steps of enrollment. There's been a lot of assistance on this document by people who have experience as Medicaid service coordinators. So in that document, there is actually a picture of the basic HCBS consent form, and it tells you exactly what you must do. So I expect that document to be out before the end of this week, and that will be communicated through the MSC advisory. The CCO implementation team here at OPW will be sending it to every MSC CEO across the state, and it will be posted to the OPWDD website. So I'm going to just defer to that because you'll have that tool to look at and specifically direct you.
Could you please clarify again if an individual resides in a state-operated IRA and has no guardian and cannot sign for himself, who signs the consent form?
Okay, so for a person who lives in a state-operated IRA, they can't make their own decision, they don't have a guardian, you need to then look at the other possible decision makers, which are outlined in the memo on the 4th. So after they can't make the decision, they have no guardian, do they have an actively involved spouse? I'm going to assume no from what I'm hearing in this particular issue. Do they have an actively involved parent? Do they have an actively involved adult child, a brother or sister who is an adult, or any other involved family member? So if they are not a Willowbrook class member, and the answer to all of those things is no, they don't have anyone, regardless of what kind of title that person has, then because they live in a certified facility, because IRAs are certified facilities, and in this case it's state operated, you're going to send that to the director of the DDSO.
I'm going to hit mute for one more moment. We've had some more questions, so we're going to take a look at them.
All right, if an MSC includes a letter attached to the consents and submissions to the DDRO that the individual's team discussed the change and the different options, does the DDRO use that when making a decision for the individual?
I think that that would be very helpful to the person making the decision. I think that in some items we've put out, you know, the list of items we're asking you to include are kind of the minimum required, but if there is another document, such as team meeting, that an MSC feels would be helpful or should be considered by the decision maker in making a decision, then absolutely you should include that.
When submitting the ISP, are signatures required on that document?
Right, so the copy of the ISP that is submitted should have required signatures.
Could you clarify, would the MSC complete the RIO information and the list of providers on the health home consent form prior to sending to the DDSO for those state-operated IRAs without decision makers?
So the issue with the RIOs is that, let's say that a person lives in a part of the state where there are 3 CCOs operating. So the RIO is based on a map that tells us which RIO is associated with a CCO. So you may not be able to fill that in because it may kind of indicate a CCO choice by your filling it in. So you may not be able to complete the list of RIO or RIOs, because in some instances there's 2 for a CCO in certain parts of the state. So if you don't know what CCO the decision maker is selecting, I don't think you could complete the RIO list.
What's the list of providers?
Hang on, okay, we're gonna just mute for a moment, we'll be right back. Okay, sorry, we just wanted to huddle here for a moment. Can you just repeat that part of the question, Megan? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so the first part was if you include the RIO information,
right, which we talked about.
And the second part was do you list the providers on the health home consent prior to sending?
Right, so there are a few providers that must be listed, right, in order for that are minimal for a consent to be acceptable. So that is the person's primary care physician, right, which you could certainly list because I'm sure you listed that in the ISP. The person's managed care plan, if there is one. So for example, a person has Empire Blue Cross, that would be their managed care plan. So yes, you can list that. That is probably also found in the ISP. And the third thing that's required is the CCO, but you're not making the selection of CCO. So you really can't put that down if there's a selection of 3 CCOs because you're not making that choice, the decision maker is. But I would suggest that when you get the consent form back, you're going to have to look and make sure that that is included. So if someone did not write that on that line, you know, at that point, you know the decision that was made, so you can add it. And yes, you can absolutely put down all of the OPWDD service providers. There is a minimum requirement for a consent to be acceptable, and I don't believe that it must include every single DD provider. I think that may also be done later, but if that's what you're doing and you're saying, for all of my people, when I send it in, I'm putting all of their DD providers, there is no problem with you doing that.
Lastly, if an MSC did not receive a tracker for enrollment in their attached to the memo, who should they contact?
Okay, so I'm not really sure why it wouldn't have come, because it was the same email with the same attachments that went to the whole state. But if you're having a particular problem with that and you feel you've exhausted your options, on this last slide, there's the care coordination mailbox at OPW, and if you just send the request there, then that will be routed correctly internally so we can send that to you.
And that's it.
Okay, great. So I think that we're all done, and again, this will be put onto the OPW website within the next few days, and thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.